Introduce myself by listing accomplishments, by trying to show you that I'm someone somehow special and worthy of standing here. But this is a talk about open source and about Africa at a community organized conference about an open source programming language and an ecosystem of open source tools. So I think being important is not important. I think being a fellow child of Africa, someone who still at heart likes to dream up an idea and finds reward in seeing if I can build it, that's important, and that's what we hopefully share. As far as Africa goes, I know I'm one of the lucky ones. My parents weren't wealthy, but they could give me enough that I could get a good education all the way to my first university degree. I never struggled to get a job. Where I live, I've got good infrastructure. I have got internet. I've got a stable supply of electricity. So I know that I can never claim to be an expert on what it feels like to face the difficulties that many others have to overcome in Africa. What I can do, though, is I can acknowledge that I'm not alone here. I'm part of a community that collectively faces these difficulties, that the fate of the individuals in this community are all interconnected, and I can care and try to understand the challenges facing us and play my small role in making things better for all of us. So, I guess many here know what open source is, but there'll be a few who may not, so here's a quick bit of background. In the 1980s, a guy called Richard Stallman in the US was frustrated. He was a programmer. At that time, companies kept all of their source code for their programs secret. Stallman thought that the software industry as a whole could grow so much more if programmers could just freely learn from the ideas of one another. So to do this, they would have to be able to free the source code from this secretive grip of companies. And he came up with a plan. He published a copyright license that anyone can use on any software they write. And basically what it would say if I use it is anyone is allowed to use or even modify my stuff and distribute it to others without having to pay anything, except I have to also, or they have to also then publish their source code under the same license, which means I get to share in what you've done as well. Richard prefers to speak of free software, but when he says that, he does not refer to the fact that you can use it for free. He's talking about the fact that the software is not kept secret inside of each company, and we're all free to learn from each other's ideas. The license, this particular license, is at the core of the main projects that made the open source movement what it is today. Now, not all projects use this license. Not all projects use a strict license like this that requires you to also give back. In fact, Python's license isn't like that. And also, there are ideological fights in the world about what you should call these things and which license to use. I'm sort of staying out of that, and I'm using the term open source here, just because I think that it's more widely known. I first came into contact with free software and Stallman's ideas around 1992, and my thoughts were, you know, I love the spirit, but will it ever amount to anything? Don't people want to get paid for their work? Well, here we stand in 2017, it's like 20 years later, and free and open source software has proven itself. You are here at a conference organized by volunteers about a language that's developed and maintained by volunteers. Most of the infrastructure of the internet runs on free and open source software. Many ideas of programming ideas are first tried out as open source software. International companies like Google run a lot of their infrastructure on free software. So it's everywhere. And business have realized that this is not just an idealistic little hobby. There's something going on here, and there's value for the business world in what's going on here. So looking at the success of it, we have to wonder, what is it that's going on? How does it work? Now, scientists have since studied the deeper question behind all of this, which is, what actually motivates anyone to do anything? And at MIT, they did an experiment. They gave a bunch of students various different small tasks to do and measured their performance. And in order to motivate the students to perform better, the students were promised different amounts of money based on how well they performed. So, like a small amount of money was given for poor performance, a little bit of a larger amount for average performance, and more money for very good performance. And what they found was that when the jobs were of the kind that didn't require any thinking, the results were as expected. The more you paid, the better people performed. But for jobs that required even a small bit of mental effort, the results were surprising. For these thinking jobs, paying people more actually led to poorer performance. So they didn't really believe this, it puzzled them. They went and repeated this experiment in other places, with other cultures, other kinds of people who weren't students, with substantial monetary rewards. And the results consistently showed the same trends. What we now understand from research like this is that money does indeed motivate people, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, especially for things that involve thinking, personal, internal motivations are needed to make people more productive. And there are basically three big ones. People do better at intellectually challenging tasks if they can decide their own direction. It's called autonomy. They do better when they feel that they are increasingly mastering a particular subject. And they're also motivated if they feel that what they do serves a purpose that they find meaningful to support. Open source software started and was driven by people who wanted to make things, experiment with things, their own ideas, and see what they can build, to learn from the process. And we now understand that it was sparked by these internal motivations. Motivations that drove these authors, despite the fact that they were actually experienced people in their field and they had other responsibilities to worry about. Now, software is very complicated. The more complicated something actually is, the less does money factor into a motivation for people to solving that problem. You need people who are driven by personal interest to make this sort of innovation happen. They think differently about the problems that they try to solve, and more often. I mean, do you wake up in the morning thinking about a problem because you're not really interested but someone's paying you, or because you're interested? Ever since the open source movement has proven itself, business took note of its success. They also realized that they need not only motivate people by paying them more, there are other ways. For example, an employer can also give its employees some time that they can use in which they're free to follow their own professional interests, powered by these internal motivations. This way, the business has these employees who perform the needed work, but the employees also have the opportunity to act on their own internal motivations. Even if the business cannot own the results of what these people then do in the traditional business sense, it still reaps the benefit from allowing open source to flourish and from allowing their employees to increasingly master important skills. And this is the sort of thing that's now widely happening in the US and Europe. There are many variations. Business sometimes fund open source projects that they find interesting. They sometimes appoint employees exclusively to work on open source projects. Sometimes they just allow their existing employees a percentage of time in which they can freely follow their own interests. The point is that when open source still had to prove itself many years or a couple of years ago, the self-motivated individuals who were doing it had a harder time because they had to make time outside of employment to make this happen. But ever since science came to understand the role different kinds of motivation plays, and since business came to understand the value of the results, individuals are now increasingly being funded by companies. I started using open source because I could do so without having to pay for it. I suppose we all start there. I worked on in companies on software that ran on Unix machines, so it was useful for me to have something similar on my own machine, Linux. So then one day I was working with a bunch of very smart people for a financial services company. We built a system that allowed clients to manage their investments online. And the job of actually administering such investments is quite complicated. It involves things like brokers who have to get a cut, tax laws have to be applied. Also, there were back-end staff that could log onto the system, and they had different access rights so that they can actually control this investment administration process, which the system partly automated, right? And we did the website of things in Python using the only web framework available for Python at the time, which was the first Zope. But we felt that building this web interface was cumbersome and repetitive, and that there was a lot of scope for human error in what we were doing. So after some observation, I thought I sort of understood what the underlying cause of our struggles were, at least in the abstract. Basically, we just had to do too much work to translate what we wanted to appear on a screen into the underlying technical web-level technologies that were actually needed to make it work, you know, the HTML and CSS. We were focused on writing the minute details of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, similar things over and over again, so we couldn't focus on the bigger picture. Now, doing this for a few screens is easy. It's only when you build a big system with hundreds of pages that it really becomes cumbersome enough to be a big problem. So at some point I decided that instead of talking about all these things in the abstract, I should rather just build something concrete, in the context of which I can experiment and learn how to deal with the relevant aspects that we struggled with. So I had this idealistic idea. I thought it's based on what virtual machines do for us, and Python itself is a wonderful example of this. There are a lot of technical things needed to make the most basic program work. Stuff like having to decide how to represent a number in memory, how to allocate and deallocate memory, how to open and close files, moving data around between the CPU and memory, and lots of things. But and when you program in a single language, you have to take care of all of those things yourself. So to illustrate, up there on the screen is an example of a Hello World program written in assembly. As you can see, it's quite a bit of work. There's the Python version. It's a lot less, right? It does the same. So what's happening here, what Python does for us is it provides words that we can use that closely describes what we want, our end result. And we don't have to write all the details of how that's accomplished in the lower level implementation. Now, a computer by itself can't execute such high-level instructions, of course, but that's what the Python interpreter now does. It takes these high-level instructions and do all the lower-level stuff for us behind the scenes. So the end result is we can do more, but using fewer words. So my idea was, can't we do the same for web frameworks? Imagine a virtual machine that allows me to just state high-level logic of what I wanted on a page, so that I don't need to care about the actual lower-level implementation. Wouldn't that be much more productive? Is it possible to build a thing like that? Can you perhaps make it possible by targeting simpler kinds of user interfaces, such as used by many systems internally, companies internally? That's a difficult vision to express to someone in words. In fact, it's impossible to really concretely say what such a thing would look like and how it would work. The only thing I could do was to try and build it. And in trying to build it, I hoped to learn lessons that would help me flesh out the details that were missing. Now, visions are like that. They're vague and difficult to communicate. They may even be misguided. I started building to experiment with my vision and make it more concrete, to learn whether I could do it. Later on, a friend joined me, and we've been building ever since. We work part-time for other companies so that we have an income, but using that, we buy ourselves a little bit of free time that we can use to work on our own project. We're not able to buy ourselves enough time to do as much as we would like. We know very much that our offering currently isn't very mature yet. That's not the point. It's a concrete expression of our vision which we can use to experiment and discover all the little missing pieces of knowledge that we need to reach our goal. We've learned, and we are continuing to learn, many hard lessons along the way. Lessons that are hard to put into words, but lessons that guide me every day on all the projects that I'm involved with. I can truly say that if we had not done this, I would not understand the discipline of software development as well as I do today. We know we're not experts on everything needed for a big project, but regardless of that, we put as much effort as we can into it, every aspect as we can, and we learn along the way. There's a bigger story currently playing out in the world. Organizations such as the UN and the World Bank regularly collect statistics relating to welfare of people in economies across the entire world. What you're seeing here is a graph of the total world population at different times. It's been augmented with some estimates from before we had data and projections of what's going to happen in the near future. Just look how it shot up fairly recently. If you zoom in on it a bit, this is what it looks like. Population growth is fairly predictable and well understood. So it's quite safe to make future predictions based on trends. If you zoom in like this, you'll see that red line is where we are today. But population is predicted to continue to grow a bit more, but stop just before hitting 12 million people. If I just sort of look at that picture, I'm guessing it's almost still gonna grow 1/2 of what it is today, roughly. Here I'm zoomed into a graph showing only the predicted trends from now up to 2100. The most noteworthy finding of these reports for some years now has been about Africa. And you can see it here. It's projected that the world population in most of the world has pretty much stabilized. It's expected to grow a little bit more in Asia, which I haven't shown separately here, but as you can see there, by far the most growth is going to happen in Africa. To give you a feel for what this means, here's a schematic of the current population of Africa. By 2050, which is just around the corner, the population of Africa will have doubled in size. By 2100, it will have doubled again. Can you imagine, just for a moment, looking around you and seeing double the number of people there is in the city right now, everywhere? What does this mean for us? Do you think we'll have food and water for everyone? Do you think we'll have jobs for everyone? Do you think they'll be able to afford the food if we have it? Housing, education, healthcare? What does this mean for our economies? Are we going to be wealthier or are we going to be poorer? Faced with this huge challenge, I have to wonder, if you pitch all the things that people tend to find important to talk about, to debate, to fight about, what is really important? The brand name of clothes from New York that's the coolest to wear? Other people's sexual orientation and what it should be? Which religion or lack of it is the right one? which language I should use to talk, or doing things because of what my culture teaches me? Or should we care about beating this oncoming challenge? I don't think it matters where you live in Africa or how well off you are. There's no way you can escape the effect of what's coming. Everything else pales in comparison. There are two lessons for me in this. We're all truly in the same boat, all of us, on this super big, super diverse continent. And we're going to have to put aside the many differences that do not really matter, roll up our sleeves and start focusing on our common problem, which does matter very much. So, what does wealth mean? You know, not everyone in Africa is poor. What you see there is a graph of the distribution of income of Africa and also the Americas in green. The Americas are in green. There's a spectrum. Some are poorer and some are wealthier. But compared to developed nations, we have way more poor people and fewer wealthy ones. We have way more people who actually live on an income of less than $2 per day, which is classified by the UN as the extreme poverty. Now, money can be used to buy frivolous things. The experts out there talk about the wealth of people in the world, and when they do that, they don't think of the importance of buying designer clothes and sports cars. They think of the ways that money can improve the quality of life for individuals all across the spectrum of poor to wealthy. They think particularly of the things that money can buy for individuals that can make our collective quality of life better. And that's what I hope we can also aspire to. If you consider improvements in the wealth of the very poorest in the spectrum, you can easily see how that improvement is good for all of us. And this is not just a story. This has been observed in places like Asia, for example. When people cannot afford education, they're typically forced to make a living from something like basic subsistence farming. For such people, it's useful to have many children because the children can help with unskilled farm work. They also do not have access, if they also do not have access to good health care, they tend to have even more children because children can die of many illnesses, and they want to ensure some survive. The parents' own survival depend on it when they get older. If such a person had access to better health care, which is a form of wealth, they would not have to suffer the sorrow of losing a child, hence improving their own quality of life. That in turn means that they can have fewer children too, because they can now expect that the children they do have will all survive into adulthood. If such a person had access to better education, they'd be able to do work that require more skill. They would earn more with less effort. The benefits so provided to the individuals themselves generally mean that people have fewer children. First, they don't need as many for their own security. They also start to invest more in their children so that the children start off better educated to begin with and have a better chance in life. You can't afford doing this if you have many children, right? All these effects end up slowing the population growth, which means less pressure on all of us to provide resources for a billowing population. It also means a better quality of life for all involved. We do need the wealthy end of the spectrum as well. For example, wealthier people like to spend money more easily, perhaps on things like the internet. A poorer person should be glad that the wealthy do that, because the wealthy are often funding the necessary infrastructure to spread internet access. A less wealthy person would perhaps not use enough bandwidth to make it economically viable for a company to put up an expensive cell tower where they live, right? But if there are wealthier neighbors around, they effectively bankroll the internet infrastructure. This benefits those who can only afford small amounts of bandwidth, because now at least they have internet access. So I think we want good economies, and we want the lives of everyone to improve. Ultimately, if you are doing better, it's good for me too. And how do we do this? If you're a business owner and I buy something from you, I'm making you a little bit wealthier, right? It's like I'm paying a small bit of your salary. I can't afford to pay your whole salary, but if enough of us buy enough things from you, it all adds up to your income. If you're my neighbor, I buy from you even more gladly, because I know you're going to take a bit of what I paid you and spend it on taxes and other things you need that improves the infrastructure right where I live. So I prosper from your income. Besides, if I'm also a business owner, chances are that you'll use some of the money I paid to you to buy something from me as well. So it's like we all get to win in little ways if we trade with one another. Consider if instead of buying from you, I decide to buy from someone on the other side of the world. We lose a lot of these hidden gains that we would have had if we had traded amongst ourselves. Now, I'm not saying we should not support people on the other side of the world. I just think we need to be aware when it makes sense to do so, and when we should rather actually trade amongst ourselves for the purpose of bolstering our own common wealth. Not because we don't like the people on other continents, we just desperately need to improve our own collective wealth. Supporting our local businesses maximizes the gains along this process. Now, there's more to be learned from population statistics. The graph here shows how many people of a particular age group are alive right now in Europe. Younger age groups are at the bottom, older ones at the top, and the wider the yellow is, the more people are alive of that age group. As you can see, there are more older people in Europe than young ones. This is a problem for them. Older people are not as economically active as younger ones, so their economies are struggling to provide what's needed to all the people because they do not have enough people of younger productive working age. Africa looks way different. In Africa, we have more children than adults or older people, way more. This puts a burden on us, almost similar to the Europeans, because children are also not economically active, yet they need food, healthcare, education. But look what's expected to happen in future when these children grow up. As each generation grows up, it means that they all become older. So we will have an increase of older people. Birth rates are expected to fall. Oops, sorry, went too far. Birth rates are expected to fall, meaning people start having just enough children to replace their own numbers. So the whole shape of this graph is going to change. What this means is that right now we're under pressure to take care of and to educate lots of young people and children, but if we invest in them, they're soon going to be sitting or giving us a winning advantage. We are going to have a lot of people of working age who can grow our economies. And this is our opportunity. Even though we face huge challenges with the coming population boom, we will soon have lots of young people at the right age to grow our economies. And better economies are exactly what we need to be able to deal with what's coming. The rest of the world are also watching what's happening in Africa quite closely. If their economies do not have much room for growth, who will they be able to sell to if they want to improve their income? Africa, of course. Because if we beat the challenges posed by this population boom, we will have more people with money to spend. This is all very good news, but we'll have to apply some wisdom once again when we engage our overseas friends in business. It'll be useful to use their investment in ways that benefit both them and us. But if we stay consumers who just buy stuff, instead of creating our own goods and services to sell to ourselves and to them, then our overseas friends will reap the most benefit. If we instead work hard and develop ourselves, we can benefit much more out of this situation and make Africa as prosperous again as it was in the 1600s. So the question becomes, how do we do that? And more to the point, to the people at this conference, what role can open source play? You can use open source that someone else developed without payment. We all happily understand the benefit of using someone else's work for free, but why would you participate in a project without expecting payment? Or work on your own project that you let others use without any payment? Why would you do this in Africa, given the economic challenges that we face, and that many of us face in our personal capacities to various degrees? What's the sense in this? Now, a lot has been learned elsewhere about open source and how it works. We can apply those lessons in the context of Africa. We know that in order to overcome the oncoming challenge, we need to grow our economies. To do that, we need to produce more ourselves. To produce more, we need to have skilled, well-educated people who can do this producing. Software cannot be learned only from books. You can learn a lot by working with a mentor, with a peer. You need to discuss ideas. You need to try things out in practice. You need to make mistakes and learn from them. The open source story elsewhere has taught us that the best way to develop yourself is to be interested in something. Pursuing an interest in software means that you have to be practical. You have to build something or participate in building something. If you do this, motivated and guided by your own interest, you will learn and grow your own knowledge and skill. Software is a perfect thing for us to manufacture. If you manufacture a physical thing, you need spare parts. You need to set up a factory. With software, you just need knowledge, a computer, electricity, and perhaps an internet connection. If you develop open source software, you can use a lot of other projects without having to pay for them. Software can be sent to and from faraway places with minimal effort. Physical things need to be packaged carefully. They need to be shipped. They're subjected to import and export governmental rules and red tape. Software is not bound by such limitations. If you have internet access, you don't even need to travel far to be able to develop software. In fact, you can right now export your software development skills to companies overseas to import money into our economy. Provided, of course, you have enough of those skills to be valuable in a worldwide context. Perhaps most importantly, and this, I can't stress this enough, software is very complex. We want to be the masters of the software that we use. And to do that, we need an ecosystem of many experts who understand the software we use, every small aspect of it. Without this knowledge, if we just use software produced elsewhere without an understanding of how it works and why it works that way, then we're not the ones in control. Then we become dependent on others. Africa needs to stand on its own feet. It needs deep experts on software development. Africa needs employment opportunities for the billions to come. We can source some of those employment opportunities from other continents, provided that we have the skills that those people need. But we're poor. Yes, some of us are very poor indeed. But, as that graph shows you, not everyone is equally poor. Those of us who can contribute to open source cannot use this as an excuse. If you are really interested enough and your situation is such that you can attend this conference, there's a good chance that you are able to become an open source contributor. If you do, you will only enrich yourself and the ones that you work with. We have another benefit in Africa. Other nations also used to be poorer They developed from where they were to where they are now. And along that road, they made mistakes, and they learned what works. We do not have to make the same mistakes to learn the same lessons. We can study what they did and benefit from their lessons. We have companies and economies currently that are growing faster than overseas economies. We do not have to wait for our open source communities to prove their value to the business world. That lesson has been learned and paid for elsewhere. Our own businesses can also adopt open source friendly policies and make it possible for more of our own people to contribute to open source. This way, they will just speed up the development of skills and the open source ecosystem in Africa, and they'll do themselves a big favor in the long run. Of course, not everyone can or wants to be an expert programmer. Different people have different natural ability. Different people are also interested in different things or different aspects of things. Some people are good at writing documentation. Some are good programmers. Some are good at helping others to work well together. Some are good at organizing community events, like this one. Some are good visual designers and can make your project look good. Some are good at leveraging their business connections and the software that others write to create businesses again. Software is just too complex for a single person to be able to be good at all the things that a large project needs. This is why we need to pool our resources, our diverse resources. It's the best way to find enough people of similar interest to work on all the many aspects involved. So, why do I say the whole of Africa must work together? Why not just Niger? I struggled a bit to get my hands on good statistics about where open source is developed in the world. But as you know, GitHub is used by many open source developers, so one possible source of such information is to look at who uses GitHub, and more specifically, who contributes to open source projects on GitHub. So at the Oxford Internet Institute, they studied the available data from GitHub on the number of GitHub users and how many commits originate from different countries in an attempt to understand who contributes to open source. The findings show how little we contribute to open source in Africa. From the report, the Middle East, Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa all together represent less than 1% of GitHub users and just about 1% of the commits on GitHub. To put this into perspective, Africa is deceptively big. This map gives an idea of the true size of Africa in relation to all the countries considered to be part of Europe, and I'm talking northern, southern, eastern, all the Europes together. They are shown in red there. Sweden, the little country in yellow there, it's smaller than Lake Victoria, I think, produces 1.4% of all GitHub commits. Compare that with the 1% of GitHub commits that the entire Africa and Middle East, which is not even shown on this map, produces altogether. Since Africa is so deceptively big, the few humans that we do have that do contribute to open source are spread very thinly and far apart geographically. The only resource you need to be able to take on bigger software problems is more skilled, educated, interested people. Given how thinly we are spread out across the continent, doesn't it make sense to pull all of us together? The internet makes it possible to do just that without even having to travel. We know that our borders have been drawn in such a way that very different people ended up in the same country, speaking different languages, following different customs. We can't really change that. What we can do is unite against the coming challenge facing us all, which is to navigate this coming population boom. All our differences become insignificant in comparison to this threat that we can actually become a continent-wide collective. So, given all of this, I have to change the question. It's not about whether open source, and especially contributing to it, is a luxury. It's a necessity for our long-term survival. There are some of us who cannot afford contributing, I know, but those of us who can, must. Those of us who cannot, can aspire to get there. African businesses have a moral obligation and a long-term strategic interest to invest in those people who are self-motivated open source contributors. They can enable these people, sponsor these conferences, help foster a future where Africa has the skills that African businesses will require more and more of. We, the open source community, have similar moral obligation and strategic self-interest to take what we get and improve ourselves, to create an ecosystem of interested experts who are the peers of those on other continents. People think about the knowledge of people in a country just like they do of monetary wealth. They talk about a knowledge economy. Growing our open source participation is growing our knowledge economy. Just like economies thrive on the fact that people produce goods and buy those goods, the open source ecosystem thrives on whether people participate in building projects and that those projects get used. Even just by using a project, you help its developers to learn where the project is immature and needs to grow. Just like with economies that rely on bought goods and services, it makes sense to grow our own knowledge economy by producing and supporting our own open source projects. A little while ago, 2 boys from Nigeria were in the news about a mobile browser. They took the source code of another browser, changed it to be less resource intensive, roughly, and repackaged it for others to use. They received high praise in the news, but I noticed how they were criticized on forums, not by people in developed countries, but by a few of their fellow Africans. These fellow Africans felt that the praise the boys received was a bit too high for what they had achieved, seeing that they really used a lot of complicated source code from elsewhere and just merely changed it and repackaged it. It's as if it was important for them to set the record straight, as if praise is something that's in short supply and it's important that it be dished out fairly. But I was thinking, who cares? They did something. What they did was not trivial. Someone noticed. Isn't it a good thing to pat them on their backs and fuel their motivation to carry on to bigger and better things? Does it matter if they get too many pats on the back? Believe me, when you develop a project, you get real feedback about how much you can achieve. You get real feedback about how your project works. There's no criticism that can help you more than the feedback you're already getting. It's way more important to support our own producers by nurturing their motivation. The Python community in particular values diversity and is supportive of everyone who tries to participate. Just go read the code of conduct of this conference to see a little bit of what I mean. Let's criticize less and support more in all the ways that we can. I think we sometimes have a self-esteem problem. We buy stuff produced elsewhere because we think only stuff produced elsewhere is of good quality. Doing that is like saying they are somehow fundamentally better than us. If we keep doing that, where will our own producers get the necessary feedback and resources that they need to improve? You need not derive your self-esteem based on what quality of project you can afford to buy from abroad. You can base your self-esteem on who you are inside and the fact that despite your situation in the world, that you can take what you have and make it into something better. If we value ourselves more, we'd be proud of every bit we can achieve in the context of the resources at our disposal. We judge and support products and projects based on their potential and on the potential of the people driving them. We'd be proud of investing and growing our own strengths and abilities. It's up to us to decide how we value ourselves. If we don't value ourselves based on our potential, despite our current situation, why should anyone else value us? We're here today at a conference organized by volunteers in their spare time. There are many Python-related events organized in this very country by volunteers. You are already showing the spirit that I advocate here. This conference derives its legitimacy not because of international visitors being here, but because of all the local people who are going to give their own talks to their own local audience. I hope that local businesses are taking note and line up to support this effort. Thank you.